Prime Time continues. Now from Washington, Sam Donaldson.
A mysterious ailment surfaced more than a decade ago, which some experts say has affected more than 2 million people across the country. You might assume that federal medical researchers have been actively investigating its cause and possible cure. But a new book, Osler's Web, by Hillary Johnson, charges that for too long, the government dismissed the disease with devastating consequences. Good Morning America's Dr. Nancy Snyderman traveled to Ground Zero to learn more.
There were no warnings. No signs in the fall of 1984 that life would be any different in Lake Tahoe than it had been in all the months and years before. For most people, nothing looked different. Nothing was different. But for some, a shadow began to fall over everything that was familiar.
I was totally disoriented, stepping out my front door literally into the street and not know where I was. We had very bright individuals who had difficulty finding their way home from the grocery store, getting lost in a small town.
Things were shifting. I couldn't figure out if I was sitting at an angle or if the rest of the world was.
It seemed that many in the Tahoe area were suddenly coming down with a bad flu, developing a weird kind of dementia and an almost total loss of energy. Dr. Paul Cheney was mystified. He had never seen patients like this in all his years of practice or study. Neither had his partner.
This seemed to be like evolving before our eyes from a flu-like illness into something else.
Your body is just limp. It's like a wet noodle.
At my worst, my IQ had dropped to 85, which is borderline mental retardation, so I'm told.
Something serious was happening, but Cheney didn't know what it was. Lab test after standard lab test showed nothing, and it seemed to be spreading through the local hotel and casino, 2 area high schools, members of a girls' basketball team.
That's when we wondered, hey, maybe we ought to call somebody. This is really unusual.
They called the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the government agency in charge of tracking epidemics. But instead of coming to the rescue, the CDC just kept putting them off.
I remember calling in from time to time and saying the numbers are up to 110 and then the numbers are up to 120, and you wouldn't believe what I saw today.
By September 1985, Cheney and Peterson had been calling the CDC for months, pleading with them to investigate the outbreak in the Tahoe area. Now they had 150 patients, many of whom had been disabled for months. Their hopes the CDC would send investigators were fading, when suddenly the CDC called. Investigators were coming. Finally, they thought, someone is coming to help. They were wrong.
This illness required that you just stare at these people and just listen for long periods of time, and that's exactly what they didn't do.
Instead, according to Cheney, the CDC investigators looked at charts and test results, took some blood samples, and headed back to the CDC without a word.
It was as if they just sort of disappeared.
Alone again, Cheney and his partner wouldn't give up. They had a theory that required using over $200,000 of their own money to order MRI scans of their patients' heads. That's when they got their first big break and discovered that their patients had lesions on their brains.
We took a stack of them to a neuroradiologist and showed them to him. And he said, very interesting, let me show you these. And I said, yeah, that looks just like mine. I said, who are these? He said, these are AIDS patients.
Another lead. The similarity to AIDS might mean his patients had immune system problems. That's where Cheney decided to look next. Meanwhile, at the CDC, the mood was anything but urgent.
The tone behind the scenes at the CDC was one of complete and utter ridicule.
Reporter Hillary Johnson has tracked the story for 10 years.
Employees at the CDC would make jokes about this disease. If anyone ever said something like, gee, I'm tired, they would be teased about having this fake, bogus disease.
In May 1986, the Centers for Disease Control released this report on the investigation of the Tahoe outbreak.
The overall message, the tone of the paper was that this did not appear to be anything at all.
To Cheney and his supporters, it was a major blow. Even the name the government gave the disease, chronic fatigue syndrome, was belittling.
It makes it sound like a benign condition. It doesn't sound catching. After all, you can't catch yuppie burnout. This is not a disease about being tired. This is a very serious brain illness. It's an epidemic hiding in plain sight.
And it wasn't just in Lake Tahoe. Over 2,000 miles away in the small rural town of Lindenville, New York, Dr. David Bell was dealing with his own outbreak.
It appeared that this was some type of a viral infection that was going through town.
And in Lindenville, that illness seemed to be targeting the young. All 4 of Jean and Paul Pollard's daughters got sick.
I felt helpless, and it was difficult to see them suffer. They suffered a lot.
With more than 50 patients ill and no answers, Dr. Bell reached out to the CDC for support, hoping he wouldn't have to battle the illness alone.
I was under the impression that this was the only place in the country where this illness was occurring.
The CDC never helped, and they never told him about Lake Tahoe. But in 1987, doctors from around the country met at a medical conference in Portland, Oregon to discuss the disease. It was there that Dr. Bell met Dr. Cheney, and they decided to join forces to look for the virus that they believed was attacking their patients' immune systems, in the hopes that finally the CDC would believe them. But it was still an uphill battle.